Imagine this. You are only 7 years old, playing outside your home when strangers arrive at your village. They aren't there for taxes, or gold, or livestock. They are there for you. And by the end of the day, you will vanish never to see your family again. For more than 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire ruled across 3 continents, shaping the destiny of millions. Today we remember its soaring mosques, powerful sultans, and brilliant conquests. But behind those golden domes and marble palaces lay a machinery of exploitation so disturbing that even diplomats of the time hesitated to describe it. What you're about to hear is not rumour, not legend. It comes from Ottoman archives, eyewitness reports from foreign envoys, and archaeological evidence that lay bare the empire's most unsettling truth. Women and girls reduced to commodities, traded with the efficiency of a corporation. These weren't rare scandals or isolated abuses. They were institutionalized practices, pillars of Ottoman governance. The empire engineered a system that turned female bodies into a marketplace of flesh, carefully categorized, priced, and sold. The most chilling fact is not only what happened, but how methodically it was organized and sanctioned by law. Records survive of auctions, price lists, and racial classifications. Slave bazaars operated openly for centuries, right up until the dawn of the 20th century, while Europe was industrializing and America was fighting its civil war. This was not a medieval relic. It was a machine of human trafficking that endured into the modern age. And to understand its scale, we must begin not with isolated stories, but with the city at the heart of the empire of Constantinople, where entire markets were dedicated to the buying and selling of women. In Constantinople, the beating heart of the Ottoman Empire, slavery was not hidden in shadows. It stood in the open, woven into daily life. By the 16th and 17th centuries, historians estimate that nearly 1 in 5 people in the city were enslaved, and the overwhelming majority of them were women and girls. Every household of status owned female slaves. Even modest families often possessed at least one. This was not an underground trade. It was a pillar of the Ottoman economy. Specialized markets existed solely for the sale of women, the most infamous being the Avret Pazari, the female slave bazaar of Istanbul, which operated openly from the 15th century until the early 20th. Think about that for a moment. This marketplace thrived not only in medieval times, but in an era when Europe was industrializing and America was torn apart by civil war. While the modern world was moving toward abolition, the Ottoman state regulated, taxed, and legalized the trade in women's bodies. Officials kept meticulous records, purchase prices, racial classifications, and ownership transfers. To the bureaucracy, women were no different from livestock catalogued and priced according to strict hierarchies. The acquisition process was equally calculated. Women were captured through military campaigns that specifically targeted civilian populations. From the Caucasus to Eastern and Central Europe, from the Mediterranean coasts to Africa, women were seized and marched into Ottoman markets. Sexual violence almost always preceded enslavement. Accounts from the fall of Constantinople in 1453 describe how women nuns included were assaulted inside churches like Hagia Sophia before being dragged to ships. Monasteries were raided and captives paraded before being sold. The empire then imposed a racial hierarchy that determined not only a woman's price, but her fate. White women commanded the highest value. Ethiopian women ranked lower. Fully black African women were relegated to the bottom tier. Syrian girls with dark eyes and olive skin occupied a middle category. This wasn't preference. It was a calculated system that determined living conditions, roles, and even levels of abuse. The price lists speak volumes. African girls might sell for 1,500 to 2,500 kurush. White girls, if destined for domestic service, could command 3,000 kurush. But as concubines, their prices often soared past 6,000 kurush, with some documented sales reaching the staggering sum of 88,000 kurush, a fortune equivalent to estates or palaces. Merchants who dealt in white slaves held higher social status. They joined elite guilds and catered to powerful clients, while traders of African women were considered lower tier. The market incentivized specialization, turning human trafficking into a profession with prestige ladders and financial rewards. But the true horror began not on the auction block, but after purchase, when these women, stripped of identity and rights, entered lives where their bodies were owned, controlled, and used at will. For a woman sold in the Ottoman slave market, the auction block was only the beginning of her ordeal. Once purchased, she entered a world where the law itself reduced her to sexual property. A Muslim man was legally permitted to have sexual relations with any female slave he owned. There were only narrow exceptions, for instance. He could not use slaves owned by his wife. But this distinction did not protect the women. It only reinforced the idea that they were objects of ownership, transferable and shareable according to household arrangements. The consequences were devastating. Women had no control over their bodies, their reproduction, or the fate of their children. A slave could be kept as a domestic servant one day, transformed into a concubine the next, or sold into prostitution if her master wished. She could be publicly displayed, stripped naked, and examined in markets, her value discussed as clinically as one might appraise livestock. Children born from these forced encounters were considered legitimate if their fathers to the owners acknowledged them. Far from discouraging rape, this legal framework encouraged systematic assault, since perpetrators stood to gain heirs and social legitimacy from the violence they inflicted. Religious scholars even issued fatwas that sanctioned extreme measures. Some rulings stated that, under certain circumstances, slave owners could kill their slaves without fear of punishment in the afterlife. This was not abstract theory. It was practical instruction for a society where slavery and sexual domination were normalized at every level. The hierarchy of exploitation extended across race and class. African women were often assigned to domestic labor and sexual use. White and Circassian women, prized for their perceived beauty, were groomed as concubines or trained in the arts of seduction for the imperial harems. Their training included poetry, music, dance, and what Ottoman records euphemistically called erotic instruction. Even within this brutal framework, markets fluctuated with international events. In the 1852, for example, after the Russian expulsion of Circassians, thousands of women fled toward Ottoman territories seeking refuge. Instead of protection, many were enslaved. British observers wrote that white human flesh had never been cheaper, with women once valued at £100 sterling sold for as little as £5. This was not random cruelty. It was a machine one that turned desperation into profit, codified in law, justified by religion, and carried out with bureaucratic precision. And nowhere was this more visible than in the most infamous institution of Ottoman power, the imperial harem. Inside the harem, a prison disguised as a palace. The word harem often conjures images of luxury: silk cushions, golden lamps, and women lounging in opulence. But the reality of the Ottoman imperial harem was very different. Behind the jewel-covered walls and ornate carpets, it functioned less like a palace and more like a prison. At its peak in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Sultan's imperial harem housed anywhere from 100 to over 1,000 women at a time. But here's what the romanticized tales leave out. The vast majority of these women would never even meet the Sultan. They weren't lovers, they were servants, property, and entertainment. Life inside the harem was harsh. Rooms were cramped and unsanitary, designed not for comfort but for control. Women were forbidden to leave under any circumstances. No men, other than eunuchs or the Sultan himself, were permitted to enter. In effect, the harem was a sealed-off world where girls spent their entire lives cut off from the outside. New arrivals, some as young as 6 or 7, were immediately stripped of their old identities. They received new names, were forced to adopt Islam, and assigned roles determined entirely by their masters. Beauty was both a curse and a ticket to further exploitation. The most attractive girls were singled out for specialized training. This training was not education in any real sense. It was conditioning. Girls were taught to belly dance, recite poetry, play instruments, and perfect what Ottoman sources called the erotic arts. Older slaves supervised the process, forcing the next generation to undergo the same trauma they once endured. Thus, victims became enforcers, perpetuating a cycle of exploitation that seemed endless. Daily life revolved around constant readiness. Women had to be prepared for sexual service at any moment, while simultaneously competing with hundreds of others for the slightest sign of favor. The system deliberately fostered rivalry. Women were pitted against one another in elaborate displays meant to amuse their masters while ensuring no bonds of solidarity could form. The psychological impact was devastating. Natural human relationships, friendship, trust, even sisterhood were corrupted. A companion one day could be a rival the next. Some were forced to participate in group encounters, compelled to assist in each other's exploitation while pretending to do so willingly. And when women failed to please or simply grew older, they faced brutal outcomes. Many were sold to brothels, discarded onto the streets, or killed outright to make room for younger replacements. The empire provided no support, no future, no recognition of their humanity. They were commodities with expiration dates, valued only as long as they pleased the men who owned them. Behind the shimmering legends of the Ottoman harem lay this grim reality, a system designed not to pamper women, but to break them, use them, and discard them. But the harem was only one part of the machine. Outside its walls, the empire constructed entire networks of trafficking, procurement, and transport, bringing new women in and feeding the demand with chilling efficiency. The trafficking networks, a machinery of human procurement. The Ottoman system of slavery did not rely on chance captures or isolated raids. It functioned like a logistical machine, with networks that spanned continents and operated with chilling precision. The empire's demand for women fueled entire industries of human hunting. From the Caucasus, Eastern and Central Europe, the Balkans, Africa, and the Mediterranean, streams of captives were funneled into Ottoman markets. Military campaigns were often planned, not only for territory, but for human acquisition. Commanders calculated how many women could be taken, their ages, and the revenue they would generate once sold. Among the most notorious suppliers were the Crimean Tatars, who perfected the art of annual slave raids. They called it the harvest season. Every year, they swept into Polish, Russian, and Ukrainian territories with military discipline, timing attacks, when men were away in the fields. Villages were surrounded before dawn, and women and children were seized with ruthless efficiency. Captives were separated immediately by age and perceived value. Girls between 10 and 15 commanded premium prices because they could be trained from childhood. Women in their 20s were prized for immediate sexual use and fertility. Those over 30 were often worked to death in domestic service or sold to brothels, where survival was measured in months. The journey to market was itself a form of torture. Captives were chained together in long coffles, forced to march for hundreds of miles. Those who collapsed were left behind to die. Pregnant women who gave birth along the way saw their newborns killed before their eyes, their bodies discarded on the roadside. Mothers had no time to grieve, chains pulled them forward. Psychological conditioning began during transport. Families were deliberately split apart. Mothers separated from daughters, sisters from each other. Captives were assigned new names in foreign languages, forbidden to speak their native tongues. Any display of grief or resistance was met with brutal punishment. By the time they reached the markets of Istanbul or Cairo, many women were so broken by shock and exhaustion that they appeared docile to buyers. And in the markets, dehumanization became a ritualized spectacle. Women were stripped naked, probed, and inspected under the eyes of strangers. Teeth were checked for age, breasts examined for signs of fertility, reflexes tested to ensure they weren't damaged goods. Virginity was verified by medical officials in public, with certificates provided to justify higher prices. The Ottoman state taxed every aspect of the trade. Fees were collected for stalls, for examinations, for transport permits, and for ownership transfers. Detailed registries tracked each woman's origin, price, and subsequent sales. This bureaucracy of human trafficking filled imperial coffers with revenue, while reducing women's lives to lines in account books. The trafficking system was so advanced, it even offered what we would now call customer service. Some merchants issued guarantees of virginity or fertility, and buyers could return women deemed unsatisfactory. Invoices, contracts, and receipts survive in archives today, documenting a machinery of exploitation as precise as any commercial enterprise. This was not opportunism. It was an infrastructure, ships built to carry human cargo across the Mediterranean and Black Sea, caravans that hauled coffles of captives through Anatolia, guilds of merchants who specialized in particular ethnic groups. It was an empire within the empire dedicated to feeding the insatiable demand for female flesh. And once these women entered Ottoman households, their suffering did not end. It transformed into a new kind of torment, one reinforced not only by economics, but by religion and law. Religion, law, and the normalization of exploitation. The Ottoman system of slavery and sexual exploitation did not operate in a legal void. On the contrary, it was entrenched in both law and religion, which gave it a veneer of legitimacy and turned brutality into routine. The empire's legal codes drew sharp distinctions between free Muslim women and enslaved women. Free women who were assaulted could appeal to the courts, protected by harsh penalties against their attackers. But enslaved women had no legal recourse whatsoever. To the law, they were property, not people. The rape of a slave woman was not a crime against her body or dignity. It was treated as damage to her owner's property, punishable only by a fine. This dual system was no accident. It was designed to reinforce hierarchy. By protecting some women while abandoning others, the empire created a constant reminder of the price of freedom. Free women were encouraged to defend the system, knowing their safety depended on the continued subjugation of enslaved women. Religion, too, was enlisted to justify exploitation. Islamic scholars within the empire produced detailed treatises explaining how the sexual use of female slaves was not only permissible but divinely sanctioned. They argued that enslaving infidel women was a religious duty, that using their bodies was a reward for the faithful, and that resisting this system was tantamount to rebelling against God himself. Slave markets were blessed by religious authorities. Fatwas were issued permitting even the killing of slaves under certain conditions, assuring owners they would face no punishment in the afterlife. This wasn't abstract theology. It was practical guidance for a society that had normalized human ownership. Inside the harems, these doctrines took physical form. Girls were conditioned not only through training in music and dance, but through rituals that stripped them of identity and rewrote their very sense of self. They were taught to view obedience as piety, submission as salvation. The empire created a parallel moral universe where rape became righteousness and slavery became sanctified service. The sophistication of the system was staggering. Merchants catalogued women by age, skin color, sexual experience, and special skills. Virginity came with warranties. Fertility could be guaranteed. Even trial periods and return policies existed for unsatisfied buyers. The business of trafficking was not a shadow economy. It was a regulated industry, with clerics, judges, and administrators all playing their part. The normalization seeped into society at every level. Children grew up in streets where women were displayed in markets. Families learned to mutilate or disguise their daughters to make them less desirable to raiders. Generations were raised to see exploitation as ordinary, even holy. By embedding slavery in both law and religion, the empire ensured that its machine of exploitation was not only tolerated but embraced. And as the centuries rolled on, the system expanded in scale, becoming one of the defining features of Ottoman rule. But when the empire finally collapsed in 1922, the echoes of that system did not vanish. They lingered in broken families, in cultural scars, and in the silent trauma carried by generations of women. Collapse, legacy, and the lessons of forgotten suffering. The Ottoman Empire officially collapsed in 1922, less than a century ago. Yet the echoes of its vast system of slavery and sexual exploitation did not simply vanish with the fall of the Sultanate. They lingered, etched into families, cultures, and societies across 3 continents. For centuries, the empire had engineered a machine that reduced women to inventory. Their bodies were catalogued in ledgers, traded in markets, and regulated by laws that stripped them of personhood. Even after the institution of slavery ended, the psychological scars remained. Women who survived the harem or the slave markets carried invisible wounds, trauma that shaped their ability to trust, to love, to see themselves as human beings beyond their sexual utility. Families, too, bore the weight of this legacy. Mothers lived with the grief of children torn from their arms. Communities endured generations of raids, where each season could mean the loss of daughters, sisters, and wives. Across Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, North Africa, and the Middle East, entire populations were scarred by the memory of Ottoman slave hunters. The impact went deeper than individual lives. By embedding slavery into law and sanctifying it with religion, the empire taught societies to view exploitation as normal, even sacred. That cultural conditioning took generations to unravel, and in some ways its shadows still linger. What makes this history so unsettling is not only the scale of suffering, but its modern proximity. This wasn't some distant barbarism of the ancient world. The female slave bazaar in Istanbul operated openly well into the 19th century during the Industrial Revolution, during the American Civil War. The last Ottoman sultan was deposed in the same century that produced airplanes, cinema, and radio. This reality forces us to confront a hard truth. Civilization is fragile. Behind the marble walls and golden domes of empire, some of the most horrific systems of exploitation in history were carefully maintained, regulated, taxed, and normalized. And yet, there is a reason these stories must be told. By remembering the women who suffered in silence, we resist the erasure of their humanity. By examining how power can corrupt law, religion, and culture, we guard against the conditions that allow such systems to rise again. The screams once echoed through marble halls. The auction blocks once stood in Istanbul's markets. Today, the archives remain. The evidence survives. The stories demand to be remembered. This is not about condemning modern Turkey or Islam. It is about understanding how power, unchecked, can twist the most intimate aspects of human life into weapons of domination. It is about acknowledging the millions of women and girls whose lives were stolen, whose identities were erased, whose humanity was commodified. And it is about carrying forward the lesson that dignity, freedom, and humanity are never guaranteed. They must be defended, or they can be lost.